Ruth Holloway did not beg when the iron touched her wrists. She stood on the auction platform with her back straight and her chin lifted, while the men below looked at her the way hungry dogs looked at a butcher's floor. Then her eyes found one man in the crowd, a broad-shouldered rancher with snow on his hat brim and old sorrow on his face. She held his gaze like she was throwing him a rope across deep water. When he turned away, she stepped off the platform before the judge could call her name and crossed straight through the crowd. She stopped in front of him, pressed a sheriff's key into his gloved palm and said, "When they call for bids, buy me and do not hesitate." Silas Boone stared at the key like it had burned through his skin. He did not know the woman, but her voice held no foolish panic. It held command. Behind her, the richest cattle baron in Red Mesa watched with cold eyes, and the judge beside him wore the look of a man who had already sold his soul and was now haggling over the price. Ruth leaned closer and whispered, "If you leave me here, 3 people will be dead by morning and one of them will be you." Then she stepped back, climbed onto the platform again, and left Silas standing in the snow with a choice he had not asked for. The market had started before dawn. Horses stamped in their pens. Men breathed smoke into the bitter air. Traders shouted over each other while canvas awnings snapped in the wind. Red Mesa sat on a hard stretch of New Mexico desert where winter had teeth, and this morning those teeth had sunk deep. Silas had ridden in for feed and a new mule harness. That was all. He had kept his life small for 6 years, ever since the army and the fire and the dead faces that still woke him at night. Small life, small talk, small hopes. He liked it that way. A man alone on a spread 12 miles outside town answered to no one and disappointed no one. Then Ruth Holloway had put a key in his hand and dragged him straight into trouble. Judge Pritchard cleared his throat on the platform and lifted a paper in one hand. "Next debtor under territorial labor statute," he called, voice dry and smug. "Mrs. Ruth Holloway, amount due $32.70. A murmur moved through the crowd. Some men looked amused, some looked ashamed, most looked careful. In Red Mesa, careful men lived longer than brave ones. Silas looked toward the platform again. Ruth stood between 2 hired men from Jasper Vane's ranch. Vane himself waited near the steps, wrapped in a fine black coat trimmed with fur. He was near 60, broad through the chest, silver at the temples, and polished like a coffin handle. Everything about him said money, power, and the habit of being obeyed. At his right stood Cole Mercer, red-haired, pale-eyed, thick through the shoulders, not a cowboy, not really. He had the stillness of a man who liked hurting people and saw no reason to hide it. Silas knew both men by reputation and by the kind of silence that followed them into a room. Judge Pritchard went on, school teacher, bookkeeper, sound health, literate, strong domestic value. Bidding begins at 33. Ruth did not lower her eyes. That more than anything set Silas on edge. Women in fear often looked down. Men in fear looked anywhere but straight ahead. But she watched the crowd like she was counting exits and weighing souls. $33 was nearly all he carried. He should have walked away. Instead, he pushed through the men at the front and said, 40. The yard went still. Judge Pritchard blinked. Jasper Vane turned his head slowly, like a wolf catching a scent. Cole Mercer smiled without warmth. The judge recovered first. "The debt is 33, Mr. Boone." Silas stepped closer. "Then 40 ought to cover it." A few men laughed under their breath, not because it was funny, because something dangerous had just begun and laughter was easier than fear. Vane spoke at last. "Did not know you were looking for house help, Boone." Silas kept his eyes on the judge. A man gets tired of keeping his own books. Ruth did not move, but he saw the smallest shift in her shoulders. Relief or surprise, maybe both. 45, Vane said. Silas had only 42 in cash. His hand tightened around the sheriff's key in his pocket. He should stop. He knew he should. Instead, he pulled the rifle from his saddle scabbard and held it up for the crowd to see. 40 in cash and this Winchester. Judge Pritchard looked sick. Public auctions like this were usually decided before they started. The poor were handed where the rich wanted them. Everyone else pretended not to notice. But now half the town was watching, and Silas had made the ugliness plain. Vane studied him. Silas met his gaze and felt the old calm return, the cold, steady calm he used to feel before a fight. At last Vane gave a shrug. Let him waste his money. The judge swallowed, sold. Silas climbed the platform, set the bills and rifle into the judge's hands, and hated the hollow feeling that opened in his chest. That rifle had been the last good thing he had kept from his old life. Ruth stepped toward him. Up close, she smelled of cold air, paper, and a faint trace of rose soap. There was strain in her face now that the crowd could not see. Her mouth was firm, but her fingers shook once before going still again. "The cuffs," she murmured. Silas stared at her. "No." "Yes," she said under her breath. "If this looks false, we both die before sunset." He hated that she was probably right. He took the iron from the bailiff, slid the key into the lock, then snapped the cuffs around her wrists. The click seemed louder than the auctioneer's hammer. Ruth drew a breath but did not flinch. Then she turned and walked down the steps beside him like a queen under sentence. The crowd parted. Whispers followed. Halfway to his horse, Cole Mercer stepped into their path. "Brave purchase," Cole said. "Hope you know what you bought." Silas answered, "If I need your advice, I'll ask." Cole's pale eyes shifted to Ruth. "You can still save yourself a hard road, miss." Ruth looked at him with cool contempt. "From you, I would gladly choose a grave." That smile vanished from Cole's face. For one instant, murder showed clear in it. Then Jasper Vane called his name, and the man stepped aside. Silas helped Ruth into the saddle. With her wrists bound, she had to lean against him as he mounted behind her. He felt the stiffness in her body, the effort she made not to tremble. They rode out of Red Mesa under a gray sky while town folk watched from porches and doorways. The church bell struck the hour. Somewhere a dog barked. Snow dust skated over the hard ground. Silas waited until the town had shrunk behind them before he said, "Start talking." Ruth glanced at the trail behind them. "Not yet." "Lady, I just sold my rifle and emptied my pockets for you. And I know it. You know a lot for a stranger." She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "I know you were Captain Silas Boone before you were a rancher who wanted to disappear." His hands tightened on the reins. The horse tossed its head. "Who told you that?" "I ask questions for a living." "You teach children." "I did that too." The answer was careful, too careful. The wind sharpened as they left the wagon road and took a narrow track through scrub and rock. Silas knew these hills well. Dry washes, broken ridges, a stand of juniper near the bend. He also knew when he was being followed. A rider had appeared on the rise behind them. He saw Ruth notice it in the same instant. "How many?" she asked. "One that I can see." "There will be more." "You expecting them?" "I was counting on them." He almost laughed from pure disbelief. "You planned this?" "I planned enough to stay alive through today." Her voice was calm again, but there was weariness under it now. A woman could hold herself together only so long while standing on a platform waiting to be sold. Silas pulled the horse into a dry creek bed lined with stone. The banks rose high enough to hide them from the road. He dismounted, lifted Ruth down, and turned her toward a boulder that blocked the wind. "No more games," he said. "Who are you really, and why does Jasper Vane want you that badly?" She watched him for a long moment. Then she lifted her bound hand slightly. "The key first." He hesitated. She held his gaze without pleading. At last he reached into his coat, took out the small iron key, and unlocked the cuffs. Ruth rubbed her wrist slowly. Dark bruises ringed the skin there, old ones beneath the fresh red marks. Silas saw them and felt something ugly move through him. She noticed his face. "Now you understand why I could not stay." He said nothing. Ruth reached inside her coat and drew out an oilskin packet, flat and wrapped tight against weather. "My real trouble is in here." "What is it?" "A marriage certificate, a survey map, a deed copy, and one letter written by a dying man." The wind hissed through the grass above the creek bank. Silas looked at the packet, then at her. She went on, softer now. Jasper Vane is not trying to collect rent from a school teacher. He is trying to bury proof that his son married me, that his son inherited the Sweetwater Spring, and that the land Vane built his fortune on was never his to begin with. Silas felt the world shift under his boots. Ruth's green eyes did not leave his face. "My husband is dead," she said. "Vane had him killed. I have the proof he missed. And now that you bought me in public, you are part of this whether you like it or not." Before Silas could answer, a rifle cracked from the ridge above. Stone burst beside his shoulder. Ruth dropped flat. Silas drew his revolver and spun toward the bank. A second shot rang out. Then a voice drifted down from the snow and stone above them, lazy and cruel. "Afternoon, Boone," Cole Mercer called. "Boss says the woman comes back with me." Silas dropped behind the boulder and fired once toward the ridge, not to hit, but to make Cole Mercer duck. The report rolled through the creek bed and came back in hard echoes. Ruth stayed low beside him, one hand pressed to the oilskin packet beneath her coat. Her breathing was fast now, but her eyes were clear. That struck him again. Fear was there, yes, but it had not taken command of her. Most people broke the moment leads started flying. Ruth Holloway only seemed to grow quieter. Cole laughed from above. "You are outnumbered, Boone." Silas glanced up the slope. He saw only one hat for certain, but brush moved farther west along the ridge. 2 more men at least, maybe 3. He cursed under his breath. Without his Winchester they had reach, and he did not. Ruth shifted closer and said, "There is another way out." He looked at her. "How do you know?" "I walked this wash last spring with my students gathering rock samples. There is a split in the bank behind those cedar roots. It opens into a narrow cut." He measured her face for lies and found none. "Can you run?" "If I have to." Another shot punched dust over them. Cole called again, "Do not make this harder than it has to be, miss. Mr. Vane still prefers you breathing." Ruth leaned near Silas's ear. "That means he needs the papers more than he needs me." Silas nodded once. That was useful. Men only hunted this hard when something mattered more than blood. He checked the cylinder of his revolver. 4 rounds left. Not much, but enough to buy movement. "When I rise, go left," he said. "Do not stop. Do not look back unless I tell you. And if you get shot, then keep running anyway." Her jaw tightened. "I did not pull you into this to leave you in it." He almost snapped back, but there was no time. He shoved the thought aside, rose fast, and fired twice toward the brush. A curse answered from above. One hat vanished. Silas grabbed Ruth's arm and they ran bent low along the wash, boots slipping over frozen gravel. Bullets snapped over their heads. The split she had mentioned appeared just when he thought they were done for. A narrow opening half hidden behind twisted cedar roots and wind-piled stones. Ruth slipped through first. Silas followed sideways, shoulders scraping rock. The passage was little more than a crack, but it widened after 10 feet into a steep slot canyon no horse could enter. That helped. Cole's men would have to come on foot, and men who liked easy killing often slowed when the path turned tight and blind. They hurried deeper between stone walls streaked with old red clay. The wind dropped away. So did the gunfire. Their footsteps and rough breaths seemed too loud. At the far end, the slot opened onto a shelf of rock above a flat basin. Silas caught Ruth by the elbow before she walked straight into open ground. Below them stood a half-collapsed stage relay, all adobe walls and leaning beams. A small stable still clung to one side. Smoke did not rise from it, but the roof looked sound enough to keep off weather. The sky had darkened while they ran. Snow clouds rolled low from the north. The storm that had threatened all morning was finally on top of them. "That is your shelter?" Ruth asked. "It is if we do not want to freeze in the open." They climbed down the shelf and crossed the basin at a crouch. No one fired. Either Cole's men had lost the trail for the moment or they were circling. Silas did not like either possibility. He pushed through the stable door first, revolver up, but found only old straw, broken harness, and the sour smell of horse years gone. Ruth moved past him toward the main room. Her steps were careful now. The rush had drained out of her all at once, leaving strain under every movement. Inside, the relay station felt like a place the world had forgotten. An iron stove sat in one corner. 2 chairs leaned against a wall. A table missing one leg had been propped on bricks. There was a blanket roll in a trunk and a crate of old kindling, left by travelers obeying that quiet frontier rule that said a stranded stranger deserved one chance at morning. Silas barred the door, checked the back window, then knelt at the stove. His fingers were stiff, but soon a small fire caught and began to breathe. Ruth stayed near the wall until the first warmth reached the room. Then she came forward and sank into the chair by the stove. She looked pale now, not weak, just worn to the bone. "You can ask," she said after a long minute. Silas fed another stick to the flame. "Start with your husband." Ruth nodded slowly. His name was Daniel Vane. Silas sat back on his heels. "Jasper Vane's eldest." "Yes." "He married you in secret." "He did." "Why?" A sad smile touched her mouth but did not stay. "Because he loved me, and because his father loved power more than blood." Daniel had spent 2 years studying medicine in Santa Fe. He was nothing like Jasper. He wanted to open a clinic, teach sanitation in the camps, bring clean wells to the outlying farms. He said a man who owned water owned too much of another person's life. That was before he learned his grandfather had left the Sweetwater Spring to him. If he married outside, the circle Jasper planned for him. Silas leaned his forearms on his knees. "Outside the circle meaning not rich enough." "Not obedient enough," Ruth said. "I was a teacher from Missouri. My father had been a survey clerk. My mother took in sewing. There was no land, no money, no useful family name. Only me." He studied her face in the firelight. "And Daniel still married you." "At the mission of San Tomas, with Father Louis and 2 witnesses." She unwrapped the oilskin packet and laid the contents on the table between them. The marriage certificate came first, yellowed but official. Then a hand-drawn survey map with careful notes in the margins. Then a folded letter worn nearly white at the creases. Silas looked at the map. Sweetwater Spring sat in the center of a valley west of Red Mesa, a place every rancher for 50 miles depended on in dry season. If Jasper Vane had no legal claim to it, then half his power was built on theft. He found out. Silas asked. Ruth nodded. Daniel meant to file the papers in Santa Fe after Christmas. He never made it. Jasper invited him on a hunting ride. Judge Pritchard went with them. Cole Mercer, too. They brought Daniel back across a saddle with a bullet in his chest and called it an accident. The room went still except for the pop of sap in the stove. "And you knew it was murder." "I knew before they told me." She looked down at the letter. "Daniel sent this the night before." Silas unfolded it carefully. The handwriting wandered in places, as if written in haste or fear. Daniel warned that Jasper had learned of the marriage. He wrote that the original deed copy and survey notes had been hidden, where the white stone leans above the dry fall, and begged Ruth to trust no local official if anything happened. Silas set the letter down. "So you found the hiding place." 2 weeks ago. "And Jasper learned you had." "Not the papers, only that I knew something." Her mouth hardened. "My rent doubled, then tripled. Debts appeared from nowhere. Judge Pritchard signed every order Jasper wanted. Yesterday they posted notice of labor seizure. Today they meant to make me vanish into somebody's kitchen, until the trail went cold." He looked at the bruises on her wrists again, "or into Jasper's house." Ruth did not answer. She did not need to. Wind hit the building then, hard enough to rattle the shutters. Snow hissed against the roof. The storm had arrived in full. For a few moments neither spoke. The silence between them changed shape. No longer stranger silence. Not yet trust, but something moving toward it. At last Silas said, "Why me?" Ruth met his eyes. "Because you are the only man in Red Mesa who looked sick when they called my debt." He gave a humorless breath. "That is a poor measure of character." It was not the only one. She folded her hands in her lap. I asked questions before I chose. I learned about Captain Silas Boone, about the campfire in Arizona, about the miners who died because someone fed you false trail signs, about how you left the army the next day and built a ranch where no one could get close enough to ask what was left of you. His shoulders went hard. You went digging. I went preparing. The words stung because they were fair. He stood and crossed to the window, though there was nothing to see beyond blowing white. After a long moment he said, 17 dead. Ruth stayed quiet. I still smell it some nights, he said. Burned wood, burned cloth, burned skin. I hear the children first, always the children. He had not meant to say that much. The words came anyway, rough and old. He braced a hand on the wall and stared into the storm. Behind him the chair creaked softly. Then Ruth rose and came to stand a few feet away, close enough for warmth, not close enough to crowd him. Cole Mercer was there, she said. Silas turned sharply. What? He was younger then, but yes, Daniel told me. Jasper used hired riders in that land grab. Men dressed one trail to look like another. Men who knew army habits. Silas felt the floor drop inside him. Old shame met new fury and became something hotter. You are sure? Daniel was sure. Outside, the wind roared against the adobe walls. Inside, the small fire threw light across Ruth's face and turned her eyes bright as green glass. Then Jasper Vane took more from you than a rifle and a quiet life, she said. Silas looked at her for a long time. Then hoofbeats thudded outside the station. Not one horse, several. Ruth's face lost what little color remained. Silas moved fast, snuffing the lamp and drawing his revolver. Through the seam in the shutter he saw dark shapes sliding through the snow. Cole Mercer's voice came through the storm. Boone, open up. Mr. Vane has come to speak for himself. Silas did not answer. He stood beside the shutter with the revolver low against his leg, listening to the wind and the creak of saddle leather outside. Ruth had already moved without being told. She gathered the papers from the table, wrapped them back in oilskin, and slid them beneath the loose bricks behind the stove. When she straightened, her face was calm again, but he saw the strain in her throat. She knew as well as he did that Jasper Vane would not be riding through a blizzard for talk alone. Cole Mercer called again, louder this time. You cannot sit in there forever. Silas glanced at Ruth. Back room. She shook her head. If they come in, they will search everything. Better they see me where they expect me to be. He hated that answer because it made sense. A new voice sounded through the storm, smooth, educated, cold enough to cut. Mr. Boone, Jasper Vane said, you have involved yourself in a family matter. I am willing to correct that mistake with dignity. Silas gave a short laugh with no humor in it. Funny kind of dignity, putting a widow on an auction block. She is not a widow. The words dropped into the room like a stone into deep water. Ruth's eyes narrowed. Outside, Jasper went on, and if she has told you she is my son's lawful wife, then she has told you only part of the truth. Open the door. Let us speak as civilized people before someone gets hurt. Silas spoke without raising his voice. You came with guns in a storm. That tells me all I need to know about how civilized you feel. A pause followed. Then Jasper said, you do not know what she is carrying, Boone. You do not know what she has done to get it. Ruth stepped closer to the door. Liar. Cole barked a laugh. There she is. Silas lifted a hand slightly, warning her back. He did not take his eyes from the shutter. Jasper's tone sharpened. Ruth, you were treated kindly for months beyond what your position deserved. You could have walked away with enough money to start over elsewhere. Instead, you stole private documents, spread wild accusations, and now hide behind a man too broken to know he is being used. Silas felt that one land where it had been aimed. Ruth must have heard it too because she turned toward him at once. For 1 second, guilt flashed across her face. Real guilt. Not fear, not strategy. That was all he needed to notice. He kept his voice level. Did you use me?" Ruth looked at him through the dark and answered at once, "Yes." The honesty hit harder than a lie would have. Before he could speak, she added, "I chose you because I believed you would help. I did not know if I was right. I took that chance anyway. But everything I told you about Daniel, the spring, the murder, all of it is true." Outside, Jasper called, "Boone, I can still pay you for your trouble. $50 in gold and a new rifle if you hand her over now." Silas almost smiled. $50 was a fortune to a man in his condition. A year ago, maybe even a month ago, the offer might have made him stop and think. But Jasper had made one mistake men like him always made. He thought every soul had a price if you named it high enough. "Keep your gold," Silas said. A bullet slammed into the shutter. Ruth flinched. Silas did not. Jasper sighed from outside like a disappointed father. "Then we do this the ugly way." The first kick hit the door hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Silas moved fast. "Table." "Now." Together they dragged the heavy table across the floor and wedged it beneath the latch. Another blow hit. Then another. Wood cracked. "There is a trap in the floor," Ruth said suddenly. He turned. "What?" She knelt by the back wall, shoved aside a broken grain bin, and exposed a square iron ring set into warped boards. Old relay stations kept coal below ground or hid stores from raiders. Silas crouched beside her and hauled. The trap came up with a groan. A black opening yawned beneath, breathing cold dirt and old dust. The door shuddered again. Cole's voice came through it. "Last chance." Silas grabbed Ruth's arm. "Down." She lowered herself into the dark. He followed, pulling the trap nearly shut over their heads. Above them, the room vanished into muffled gray sound. He could just make out Ruth's outline in the cramped space. The cellar was narrow, shoulder-tight, with dirt walls braced by old timber. Barrels lined one side, long empty. A ladder leaned broken in a corner. The door above burst open. Boots thundered across the floor overhead. "Search it." Coal, a chair smashed, crockery shattered. Someone kicked the stove. Silas and Ruth crouched in the dirt with barely enough room to breathe. He could hear her trying to slow her breath. His own heart pounded so hard he was sure the men above must hear it through the boards. A boot stopped directly over the trap. Silence. Then Cole said, "Fire's warm. They were here." Another man answered, "No horses in the stable but Boone's. Maybe they slipped out the back." Jasper's voice came from farther off. "Find the papers." The boards above creaked. Dust sifted down into Ruth's hair. Silas had been in tighter places before. Army tunnels, canyon cracks. A burning tent once with men screaming outside, but this was worse in one way. Then he had understood the fight. Here the danger wore a clean coat and called itself lawful. The boot moved away. For what felt like a year, the men searched. Silas heard furniture shoved, walls struck, curses, Cole's temper rising with each minute. At one point, something heavy hit the stove and rolled. At another, a man laughed and said, "Maybe the little widow took flight." Then Jasper spoke again, closer now, and Silas knew the man had not left the room. "She is clever," he said quietly. "Clever people mistake delay for victory." Ruth's fingers found Silas's wrist in the dark. Not by choice, by instinct. He did not pull away. A long minute passed. Then came a different sound from above, the sharp crackle of flame. Ruth went rigid. Silas whispered, "Stay still." "The stove," she breathed. "They tipped the stove." He knew. Smoke began slipping through the seams almost at once, faint but growing. Jasper Vane was not willing to search all night in a blizzard. He meant to smoke them out like badgers. Above them, Cole laughed. "We will wait outside. When they come choking through the door, I claim first shot." Footsteps retreated. The outer door slammed. Wind roared briefly, then dulled again. Silas shoved the trap open and rose into a room already filling with smoke. One curtain had caught first. Now fire licked along the dry window frame and climbed the wall. He ran to the back door, but when he threw it open, he found it chained from outside. Ruth came up behind him coughing. The window. He rammed the chair through the rear window. Glass burst outward. Snow blew in. The opening was small but enough. He boosted Ruth through first, then hauled himself after her into the storm. They landed in snow behind the station just as orange light spread inside the room. From the stable side, a shout went up. There! Silas grabbed Ruth and ran for the arroyo beyond the ruined corral. Bullets tore splinters from fence rails. A horse screamed somewhere in the white dark. He could barely see 10 feet ahead. Good. The storm was terrible, but it cut both ways. They slid down into the arroyo and scrambled along its frozen bed until the station's glow faded behind them. Only when the gunshots stopped entirely did Silas pull her beneath an overhang of rock and dead brush. Ruth bent double, coughing. Smoke and cold had turned her face ghost white. Silas stripped off his scarf and wrapped it around her mouth. Breathe through that. She obeyed, then forced out, "They meant to burn us alive." Jasper did. She leaned back against the rock. Snow gathered in her loosened hair. He is afraid now. Silas looked into the storm. Afraid men are dangerous. She gave a weak, bitter smile. So I have learned. He studied her in the half-light. Tell me what he meant, about part of the truth. Ruth shut her eyes for a beat. When she opened them again, grief had settled there like old winter. Daniel and I were married. That part is true, but there is more in the deed than inheritance. Silas waited. The spring is tied to a second claim, mineral rights under the valley. My father saw the survey once years ago when he worked territorial records. He told me there was silver down there, not enough to turn Sweetwater into a mining camp, enough to make Jasper Vane richer than he already is and powerful enough to buy judges from Santa Fe to Washington. That widened everything. Water was one kind of power, silver was another. Together they explained murder, debt seizures, and a man willing to burn a woman alive in a storm. You knew this from the beginning? Silas asked. No. Daniel only confirmed it in his letter. He thought the spring mattered more because it touched people's lives at once, but he knew his father would kill to keep the rest hidden. Silas stared out at the blowing snow. Somewhere behind them men hunted through white dark with lanterns and rifles. Ahead lay miles of rough country, little food, and fewer friends. He should have hated her for choosing him, for forcing him out of the grave he had built with his own hands. Instead, what he felt was worse and bet her both. Purpose. Ruth's voice came low through the scarf. If you walk away now, I will not blame you. He turned to look at her. That may be the first foolish thing you have said. A flicker of surprise touched her face. He went on. Jasper Vane burned people in Arizona to clear ground. He murdered his own son for land and water. Tonight he tried to burn us alive. I am done walking away from men like that. For the first time since he had met her, Ruth's control slipped completely, not into tears, into something quieter, relief so deep it hurt to see. She looked at him like a drowning person looks at shore. Then from somewhere up on the bluff came the distant sound of a hunting horn. Cole Mercer. One blast, then another. Ruth stiffened. That is how they call riders to close a circle. Silas rose at once and offered her his hand. Then we move before the circle closes. She took it and he pulled her up from the snow. The storm swallowed them as they pushed deeper into the hills, two dark figures against the white, hunted now in truth. Behind them the relay station burned like a warning fire. Ahead, buried under cold and darkness, lay the only thing that could break Jasper Vane's hold on Red Mesa, the original deed. And if Ruth remembered the letter correctly, it was hidden beneath a white stone above a dead waterfall in Black Run Canyon. The snow continued to fall in thick, heavy sheets, turning the world into a blur of white and shadow. Silas moved carefully, keeping low, listening to the wind scream through the canyons. Ruth stayed close, her breath misting in the air as she matched his pace. The cold gnawed at their skin, but neither spoke about it. The night seemed too thick for words. They had slipped from the relay station's shelter the moment the horn sounded. The men who had been hunting them were no longer behind them. For now, the wind and the darkness worked in their favor. But that wouldn't last long. Not in this kind of storm. They reached the edge of Black Run Canyon just as the moon began to peek through the clouds, its light casting pale shadows on the snow-dusted cliffs. The wind was less fierce here, but the cold bit deeper, and Silas could feel it crawling under his skin. This part of the desert had its own kind of silence, deep, unbroken, as if the land itself had stopped breathing. They stopped by the canyon's edge. Below them, the land dropped sharply into a series of jagged rock walls and dry stream beds. Silas scanned the area, looking for the landmarks that Daniel Vane had described in his letter. The water's edge was close, but he needed the marker stone, the one that would confirm what Ruth had said. He knew the valley well enough to know this wasn't a place most men would travel, and that worked to his advantage. Jasper Vane had too much ground to cover. Ruth looked at him, eyes squinting against the harsh wind. "This is where Daniel said the stone would be." Silas nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve. "He said it's near a dry waterfall, white rock, hard to miss if we're in the right spot." "And you believe him?" "Not Daniel," Silas answered, glancing back at her, "but I believe the map, every word of it." She held his gaze for a moment, her lips tight but her eyes searching for something, maybe for hope, maybe for proof. He could see that she was tired, her legs stiff from hours of moving through snow, the tension in her shoulders speaking louder than her calm expression. Without another word, Silas turned and began moving down into the canyon. Ruth followed without hesitation. The ground was rocky, uneven, almost treacherous. Silas had been through here before, but it was different in the snow, the trails harder to see, the footing more dangerous. He stopped at the base of the first rock outcrop and crouched low, eyes searching the crags and crevices. "I don't want to wait for them to catch up," Ruth said, her voice low. "Not here." Silas understood. They had precious little time before Vane's men figured out where they'd gone and began hunting the canyons for them. The chance to find the deed to prove everything she'd said was quickly slipping through their fingers. "Stay close," he muttered, scanning the rock face in front of him. Then he saw it, a weathered stone, half buried under a heap of scattered rocks and dry branches. The shape of it was off too smooth for natural rock. He moved quickly, kicking aside debris, revealing a large white stone that had clearly been here for years. It was marked, not with words but with a symbol, a crude engraving of a circle with 4 lines extending outward. The same symbol he had seen on the survey maps in Ruth's packet. He kneeled beside it, checking the ground around it, and found what he was looking for, a metal box, buried beneath layers of dirt and rock. It was old, rusted, but still intact. His hands shook as he lifted it from the earth, brushing away the centuries of dirt that had collected around it. With a deep breath, he pried open the lid. Inside was a stack of papers wrapped in faded leather. A sense of relief washed over him for the first time since they'd been hunted through the snow. He reached for the documents inside, carefully unfolding them. The first page was the deed, its text barely legible but still readable. The second page was a map, the water rights clearly marked. And the third? The third was a letter written in the same hand as the one in Ruth's oilskin packet. A letter confirming everything Ruth had told him. The truth was here. The deed, the map, the confession. "I found it," he said, holding the papers out to Ruth. She looked at them like they were something sacred, her hand trembling as she took the papers from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind howled above them, but below in the canyon it was quieter. Ruth looked down at the documents, reading over them quickly, her eyes scanning the text with a rapid, almost frantic pace. Finally, she let out a breath and looked up at him. "This is it," she said, her voice hoarse but full of triumph. "We can stop him, Silas. We can stop everything." He nodded, the weight of it pressing down on him. This was the turning point. They had the evidence. They had the proof. Now all they needed was to get it to someone who could make it matter. But Ruth's gaze turned hard again, focused on the narrow canyon path leading back to the station. She narrowed her eyes and shook her head. "Not yet, we're not done." "Done with what?" Silas asked, following her line of sight. He knew they weren't out of danger yet, but they had the advantage now. "Done running," she said, voice filled with resolve. I'm done being afraid of him, Silas. This is my fight now, and I'm not going to hide anymore. He stared at her for a long moment, then reached out and gripped her shoulder. I'm with you, but we need to move fast. If we're going to get this to Santa Fe, we have to leave tonight. She didn't hesitate. Ruth stood tall, ready to face whatever came next. Then we move tonight, she said. And when it's over, we put an end to Jasper Vane once and for all. They made their way back up the canyon, their footsteps careful but quick. Silas felt a shift in the air, a change that wasn't just in the storm but in the way Ruth held herself, in the way she walked beside him. She was no longer just the teacher who had been desperate to escape. She was a woman who had fought for her life and won. And now she was fighting for something bigger. Back at the station, the snow had thickened, but the fire inside burned bright. As Silas packed the documents away, Ruth moved to the window and glanced out at the snow-covered hills beyond. Silas turned, watching her. We'll make it through this, Ruth. She looked at him, her eyes steady, unflinching. We don't make it through, Silas, she said, her voice low, filled with fierce resolve. We make it better. The weight of her words hung between them, and for the first time in a long while, Silas felt something shift inside him. He had come to this place thinking he could run forever, hide from his past and his guilt. But Ruth Holloway had given him a reason to fight. And for that, he would stand beside her whatever came next. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the relay station, Silas felt the quiet calm of knowing what he had to do next. Tomorrow, they would head toward Santa Fe. But tonight, they had a chance to rest and regroup. For the first time in years, Silas allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. Ruth sat by the fire, her fingers running over the leather case holding the documents. She didn't look at him, but he could see the weight lifting from her shoulders. We'll win, he said quietly. Ruth nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, we will. The snow continued to fall, thickening with each passing minute. The fire crackled in the corner, casting long shadows across the small room. Silas sat at the table, the documents spread before him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The road to Santa Fe stretched out before them, but every step would be hard-earned. Every moment spent evading Jasper Vane's men would be a gamble. Outside, Ruth stood watching the storm. He could see her silhouette against the glass, her hands pressed to the window as though trying to will the snow to stop. They both knew what lay ahead, an uncertain journey, a fight for justice that would require everything they had. Silas stood, stretching his stiff muscles, and walked to where Ruth stood. The howling wind outside muffled everything else, leaving them in a cocoon of silence and the soft crackle of the fire. You're still thinking about what happens when we get there, Ruth said, her voice barely above the storm's roar. Silas hesitated, then nodded. We're not just facing Vane. We're facing everything he's built. He's got power in places we can't even reach yet. Money talks louder than anything else out here. He paused, his gaze drifting to the fire. And if we fail, it'll only be worse for everyone. Ruth turned, meeting his eyes. But if we don't try, it stays the same. People keep dying. Families keep losing their land. The truth stays buried. Her lips pressed into a hard line. You said we make it better. I'm ready for that, are you? Silas looked at her, at the firelight that danced in her eyes, and realized something that had been sitting at the back of his mind for days. She wasn't just determined, she was resolute. She was willing to face down the worst of it, and if she was going to do that, so was he. Yeah, he said, voice steady. I'm ready. A sudden knock at the door interrupted them, and Silas's hand went to his revolver instinctively. Ruth moved toward the window. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Silas stepped quietly to the door, listening for any sign of who might be outside. His heart raced as the silence stretched out, but then the knock came again, softer, more cautious this time. Who is it? Silas called. Just me, came a voice from the other side, familiar but with an edge of tension. He opened the door to find Jonah Pike standing on the threshold, his face wind-burned and tense, eyes darting to the shadows. Behind him, snow piled high in drifts. You shouldn't be out here in this storm, Silas said, stepping aside to let him in. What's going on? Jonah shook his head, stamping the snow off his boots. Things are moving faster than we thought. I came to warn you." "Warn us?" Ruth asked, stepping closer. "What's happening?" Jonah took a deep breath, glancing behind him before closing the door. "Coulter's men are closer than you think. They've started gathering in Dry Willow, making sure no one gets out without their say-so. They've set up checkpoints. I've never seen the town this tight before." Ruth's face tightened. "So they know we're leaving, and they're preparing to stop us." Jonah nodded grimly. "They're not just after you, Ruth. It's bigger than that. They know you have the papers, and they'll do anything to make sure those don't make it to Santa Fe. They're going to send every rider they've got after you." Silas clenched his fists. "Then we leave sooner than planned." Ruth stepped forward. "We need supplies, fresh horses. We're not getting far without them." Jonah was already shaking his head. "I can get you horses, but they won't stay untracked for long. There's a ranch nearby just north of the canyon. I've got an old friend there. He'll get us what we need, but we'll have to move fast. There's a good chance they'll be watching the roads tonight." "How long will it take to get to this ranch?" Silas asked. "Not long if we stay off the main trail. We'll have to go through the east woods where the trees break the wind. Maybe a few hours if we're lucky." "Then we move now," Ruth said, already pulling on her coat. "We can't wait for them to come after us. We have to stay ahead of them." Jonah nodded, his jaw set with determination. "I'll get the horses ready. You two take care of what you need to take." Without another word, he turned and headed out the door, leaving Ruth and Silas standing in the quiet of the cabin. "Are you ready for this?" Silas asked softly. Ruth didn't hesitate. "I have been ready since the day they killed Daniel. I'm done running from men like them." A chill ran down Silas's spine as he looked at her, the weight of their journey ahead sinking in. "Then let's get moving," he said. The wind whipped across the canyon as they made their way through the trees, the snow turning to sleet as they reached the ridge overlooking Dry Willow. Jonah's horse was moving like a shadow, sure-footed and steady. Ruth stayed close behind Silas, her face pale but determined. They didn't speak much on the ride, but the tension between them was palpable. The dark silhouette of the ranch appeared through the trees just as the last light of day faded from the sky. Jonah signaled for them to slow as they reached the outskirts. The place looked abandoned at first glance, but Silas could make out the faint glow of light through a back window. Jonah moved first, his horse close behind him. "Stay here," he said quietly. "I'll get the horses ready. Don't make any noise until I come back." Ruth and Silas dismounted, the cold biting into their bones as they moved into the shadows. Silas kept a firm grip on his revolver, but the silence of the ranch left him uneasy. Minutes ticked by, and Silas could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running before Jasper Vane's men found them, but he wasn't ready to give up, not when they were so close. Finally, Jonah returned, his face grim. "The horses are ready," he said. "But there's a problem. The roads are more heavily patrolled than I thought. We can't take the main trail south. It's too risky. We'll have to head west through the hills." Ruth nodded, adjusting her pack. "Then we go west, let's go." Silas looked one last time at Dry Willow, the town that had tried to crush Ruth's spirit, and felt a sense of finality settle over him. He didn't know what awaited them, but he was certain of one thing: they weren't going back. "Let's go," he said. They mounted up and headed west, the storm howling around them, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the night. The real fight had only just begun. The wind howled across the hills, pushing them westward like a force of nature intent on forcing them through the night. Ruth's face was set in hard determination, her eyes scanning the snow-laden landscape ahead, but there was a weariness about her that Silas couldn't ignore. He knew how far they had come, how much they had already sacrificed to get this far. The road ahead, though necessary, seemed nothing less than impossible. The canyon walls around them rose like sentinels in the night, jagged and shadowed, their cold stone faces reflecting the pale light of the dying moon. Jonah led the way, his eyes narrowed against the wind, guiding them through narrow passes and uneven ground, keeping them well off any main paths. His horse was steady, but Silas knew better than to trust the terrain. The east woods had been dense and slow-moving, but they were close now, and the threat of discovery was growing with every hour they pushed forward. Jonah stopped abruptly, his hand lifting to signal the group to halt. Silas did the same with Ruth, pulling his horse to stop behind Jonah's, the sound of hooves crunching into the snow echoing in the still night. "What is it?" Ruth whispered, her voice sharp but soft as they all leaned forward. Jonah scanned the area, his gaze darting to the horizon. "Riders," he muttered, his voice low, tense. "Too many to risk crossing. They're moving fast, probably searching for us. We can't go forward, not like this." Silas cursed under his breath, running a gloved hand through his hair. They were being hunted again. The thought burned through him. But they weren't backing down, not now. Jonah's voice was quiet but firm. "We can't stay here, not with them close. We need to find shelter, something they won't see from a distance. There's an old cabin further up the ridge. Used to be part of a trapping route." "Lead the way," Silas said, his voice low and steady. "We move now." They pushed forward, the terrain growing rougher as they climbed higher into the hills. The wind seemed to follow them, biting and relentless, but Silas kept his focus on Jonah's back as they wound through the snow-covered rocks. Each step they took felt heavier, weighed down by the knowledge that the storm had not only come for them but was closing in around them. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the cabin, a small, weather-beaten shack nestled against a rocky outcropping. It wasn't much, but it would provide enough shelter to give them a chance to regroup. The door creaked as Jonah pushed it open, his face grim as he looked back at them. "Get inside. We'll only have a few minutes before they pass. I'll keep watch," Jonah said, slipping past them into the darkness of the cabin. Ruth hesitated for a moment, looking at Silas, her eyes full of questions and concerns. "Do you think we can make it to Santa Fe?" she asked quietly. Silas didn't need to think. He didn't need to look out into the snowstorm or feel the bite of the cold wind gnawing at his skin. He already knew. They had to. "We're already too far in to turn back," he said, his voice steady despite the doubt gnawing at the edges of his mind. "We make it through this and we'll make it to Santa Fe. I don't care how." Ruth nodded, her face hardening, and for a moment Silas saw the woman who had stared down a bullet for the truth, the same woman who had come to him when she had no one else to turn to. "Then let's get it done," she whispered. They followed Jonah inside, the door creaking shut behind them. The cabin was small, with only a few crude pieces of furniture and a long, cold fireplace. Jonah had already settled by the door, his rifle resting across his lap as he stared out into the storm. "We wait," Jonah muttered, "but we don't stop. We can't. Not until we get to Santa Fe." The next few hours were a blur of cold, discomfort, and the constant tension that hung over them like a dark cloud. Jonah kept watch, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of danger, while Silas and Ruth sat near the fire trying to stay warm. Ruth broke the silence after a long while, her voice low. "You think they'll stop coming after us, after tonight?" Silas stared into the fire, his eyes distant as he thought about the journey ahead. "No," he said, his voice quiet. "But that doesn't matter, because we're going to keep moving forward, Ruth. Every time we make it through, we get closer to the end." She nodded, her gaze distant too, as if her mind was already several steps ahead, as if the danger and fear had become as much a part of her as the cold wind that blew through the cracks in the cabin walls. But for the first time since they'd met, she looked steady, sure. "Then we keep going," she said, her voice firm. Jonah stood up, his boots crunching on the cabin floor as he moved toward the window again. "They're gone," he said, his voice low. "We move now." Without hesitation, they rose to their feet, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them with every step. As they stepped out into the snow again, Silas looked at Ruth, his eyes meeting hers. There was something different now, something stronger in her gaze. They were no longer running from their past. They were moving toward a future they would create no matter what. And as they rode into the storm, the world seemed to hold its breath around them, as if the land itself was waiting for them to make their stand. They would make it to Santa Fe, no matter the cost.